alibi that we didn't get the minutes out for people to review, so we won't try to review and approve the meeting minutes that were posted. We'll get those added to an upcoming agenda. Matt, if we could start, I think probably just start with the wastewater, and let's open the discussion, I guess, with the equivalent meter discussion. Yep. And then show the, I guess maybe even start with the charts and show the graphs and see if that's, and get folks' comments on that. So what Matt and I kind of worked on this week was a better way to graphically portray, you know, the varying examples that we have. So we tried to lay some over on top of each other, put multiple ones on group them on graphs and that kind of thing. So we want to try to get some input as to what's going to be the best way to take those forward when we have to go to the board and present them, so that they can understand them. And we added some additional examples. So I think we're up to 10 or 12 now of everything we could think of that we might want to look at, but there may be something else that one of you guys thinks it'd be a better way to display it. So can you grab the screen, Matt?
Yeah, I thought I did. Are you not seeing my screen right now?
No, I'm not, but that may be me. Yeah.
Okay, one sec. You really can't see it right now?
No.
Are you in the meeting?
Yep, I thought it was. Hang on.
Can you confirm you're in the meeting?
Hang on. I'm looking. Somehow I'm in the international grouping, so I clicked on the wrong link. There we go. And now we have it.
Now you can see it?
Now we can see it.
Okay. All right, well, like Kevin just alluded to, we spent some time over the last week or so trying to come up with another graphical representation of the data that we're showing, but one that's more useful than what we've been showing. Now, you clearly recall, because we've been over it several times, that we have user examples like these graphs right here. I've minimized them a little bit just so we could fit more on the screen. I'm going to maximize it in the second one. We have to look at specific data points, but for now, just looking at the graph impact overall, we focused on graphs like this to show a particular user example. From the beginning of when we've worked on this, and those have data in the workbook. One addition really is that we talked about this, I think, the last two times. In addition to presenting what the bills look like last fiscal year, FY19, and what our recommended rates or calculated rates show, we've added the quote-unquote interim rate to the graphs here. So that's why there are 3 lines now, as opposed to the 2 that you saw prior. For this particular graph that we're looking at the moment, the blue line represents the FY19 bills, the orange line represents the interim, and the gray represents the calculator recommended rates that are in this workbook. Okay. So we still maintain we have these graphs available, but these tell individual user pictures, and it's hard to relate or compare the different user examples to one another without doing a lot of scrolling or copying and pasting. Still possible, but not easy. So Kevin took it as kind of an initiative of his to see if we could come up with a little bit of a better graphical or an easier way to interpret the data, or maybe a more centralized way is a better way to say it, so that we could more easily compare user examples And he thought it made sense to go with bar graphs, and I've since agreed with that. But what this allows us to do is to get multiple examples on one graph. So I've minimized this, I've backed it out just a little bit so you can kind of see the different bar graphs and the colors that they are. Excuse me, and you can clearly see that there are 5 different examples here. I'll show you the what examples they are in a moment. So what this is meant to represent is the FY19 scenario, which is the far left blue bar graph, far left bar, the interim, which is the orange, the next bar, and then the calculated rates in the workbook. This option that we're looking at is option 3, which is the 4-year leveling. So we have 3 bar graphs in here because they represent 3 different rates. Because we're looking at a 12-year period and we're using leveling of 4 years, there are only 3 different rates that are calculated. It didn't make sense to show all 12 bars because there are bars that are the same, redundant bars, I guess would be the word I'm looking for. So instead we've just showed each calculator rate once for space reasons and to make it easier to interpret. Now, if we're thinking about the other scenario, the other option, that's going to be a little bit of a different story because there are more rates calculated in those scenarios, or I guess less in option 4. So it's going to show a little bit different, as you can see here. There are more bars showing for option 1, which is the 2-year leveling. So there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different rates that are calculated, whereas in option 4 there are only 3. So I just wanted to point that out.
Hey, Matt, Roger here, and this may be because we're a ways away from the screen, but you have, in the screen we're looking at now, you have 5 different bars, and you talked about, I thought, from left to right were the blue, orange, and gray are the 19, the interim, and then the period going out 4 years. What is the dark blue and the yellow?
5 through 8 and 9.
So I'm making it bigger now, so you can see what the legend says. I just accidentally scrolled down. Sorry about that. But the legend tells you what each represents. So blue is FY19, like you said. Orange is interim bills, and then the 3 other colors represent the 3 different calculated rates
I see.
for this particular option. Because this option is for a 4-year leveling. So there are only 3 different rates calculated. We only need 3 different bar graphs. Whereas for the other option, for example, I showed this one has more because there are more rates calculated because this is a 2-year leveling option where the rate changes every 2 years. Here the rate changes every 4, so we're able to use less bars, less space, easier to interpret.
And we're looking at wastewater here?
Correct.
Scroll up to the title. Is that shown on here that this is wastewater?
The name of the workbook is wastewater.
Right, but I think when you're showing these, it would be helpful if you're showing these like you are now. If we didn't know we were in the wastewater book, you don't know what these represent. The other suggestion would be, if you scroll to the top there, I think you said what, average residential user or something like that is the title?
You want me to scroll to the top? Sorry.
Just the top, top of what you're showing here, just to see what the labeling is. Of quarterly billings. Well, wait a minute.
Yep.
So these are quarterly, not annual?
No, okay.
Should just say something like 1-inch meters.
Maybe it's mislabeled. This represents the 1-inch meters, so they're billed quarterly. But these are annual numbers.
And for what size account is this? I saw something before where you talked about average residential or something.
They're all across the bottom. 1-inch meter, 4,000 gallons.
Oh, I see. Okay, so
One
this
inch
is
meter,
broken up.
20,000, 40.
Yeah, I was going to walk you through the examples.
I'm
I
sorry,
haven't
jumping
started doing
ahead.
that.
Go ahead, Matt.
I'll be quiet.
I'm just kind of, Roger, so far I've just been talking about the process of how we got here. But yes, now's a good time to start talking about the examples. So what we decided to do with the different user examples was continue to use the same ones, add one additional 1-inch meter example because we had the 4,000, which is the leftmost one here. Then we had the 20,000, which is the next one. Then we had the 40,000, which is the next one. And then we had the 100,000 one. We didn't have one that kind of bridged that gap. So we decided to add an 80, which you see here. So that's a fifth 1-inch meter example. And these are all quarterly accounts. So we decided to put them on one graph and keep them separate from the monthly accounts. And those are represented on the chart just below. There are more. So we have 8 different ones here. You may recall from the user examples that we were carrying in the analysis throughout, we had one 1.5-inch meter example, we had one 2-inch meter example, we had one 3-inch meter example, and we had one 4 or larger meter example. And Kevin and I decided to add additional ones. So we've added a second example for each of those meter sizes I just laid out, which is how we got from the 4 to 8 that you're now seeing in front of you. We had on here the largest wastewater user in the data set that I use for this analysis. And that's the one on the far right that you can see that extends beyond what we're looking at here. But that skews the scale a little bit here. You can still see the impact of all the other ones, but when you get over to this leftmost one, it's really hard to kind of see those. But if you were to hover over them, I believe if you were to hover over them, you would actually see the dollar amounts, or maybe they're too small for that. Yeah, there you go.
But Matt, I think this is Kevin. I think if we were to use something like this, we'd probably have to split this one into 2, so that the scale would be more easily read.
Okay.
So you maybe do the 1.5 and 2s, those 4 on one, and then the other ones.
Can I take a
that's fine.
Yeah, sure.
counter perspective?
Yeah.
That's a good idea.
If we're talking about the totality of the public that's going to look at this, I think visually they probably need to see from the min to the max what's actually going on. In other words, and they'll see that the relationship between the worst case and best case, so to speak, is very dramatically different. I think if you break it up into groups and do it, I think you'll lose some of that granularity.
Maybe you start with one with
Overview,
everything on it.
yeah, and
go
then
from nothing
drop down.
to huge,
Right.
and then cut it into segments.
Right.
Okay.
I think this sort of sets the stage to give some perspective.
Well, you also could have, and I'm not saying you don't do this as shown, but you also could have a slide available or as a backup just showing what these actual dollar amounts are for these 2, 4, 6, 8 cases. I mean, you could just do a table that would show the actual numbers, because the one thing you have to do here, although it shows them, graphically, you still have to look over and try to figure out, okay, what is this in dollars?
So that's kind of what, I mean, that's the bottom part of the workbook that produces those graphs. And I don't think we could show that.
Here he's got something here, I think, that does that, yeah. Now, Matt, that does, something we got just before the meeting, I think from you, well, you sent to Kevin, he forwarded us about the ready to serve in the AWWA manual for meter size. Do the numbers we're looking at in the graphical representations reflect that at this point for wastewater?
No.
Okay.
It still reflects the same way we've been calculating it in the workbook.
Okay.
This is a newer item to discuss, and if the group likes it, then we can get into the workbook, but for now it's not in there.
Okay, thank you. So the chart you just had, if you could go back a second, just so we can sort of look at numbers instead of the graph. Can we just look at that a minute and then just give us a minute to absorb that? Even though you say these are monthly billings, these numbers are annually, correct?
Yes, that's correct. Monthly is meant to represent how often these accounts are billed.
I think to avoid any confusion, you might want to consider labeling that somewhere. Otherwise, this could be interpreted as a monthly charge.
I can do that.
Or alternatively, the one above it could be interpreted as a quarterly charge. And I don't think you mean that, right? These are all annual?
That's correct.
Okay. So there's, using the current methodology, going from the smallest bill to the largest bill, we're talking about anywhere from $100 a year to $63,000 a year, right? In the largest 4-inch meter.
Are you looking at just the top row? So that would be just the FY19 row.
Oh, I'm sorry, yeah, we ought to be looking at, yeah, something else, I'm sorry. We ought to be looking at the 20 to 23. It's gonna range from a little under 200
Right.
to...
Yeah, with the year leveling, these are the rates well, not the rates, but these are the yearly billings that we've calculated for these accounts with the rate and the ready to serve for FY20.
And the most typical size that you have on the 1-inch meter is case number 3, or what would you say is where do most of the accounts fall? Within case number 3?
3 is 40,000 a year, 40,000 gallons a year.
Is
So
that
what's
where
the average? Isn't the average less than that? I can't remember off the top of my head what we were carrying as an average.
I guess I'm more interested in more than an average is where do most of the accounts fall? Most of the residential accounts, let's say.
You have that on one of the tabs.
If I can find it quickly.
I thought you had a chart or graph that showed how many then fell into each, maybe it may have been a page.
That wasn't based on usage, that was based on dollar amount.
That's, okay.
Well, let's look at case 2 and 3 versus the upper level cases if you want to go. If you don't have that, we'll go back and just compare what we think is the case. There's 2.
Oh, here we go. So, this is not, these are just counts that I've done on the side. I haven't formalized it at all. But this row right here, these are the number of bills. That's not going to get you what you want. I can do a quick calc for you. I don't have it readily available, but I can have one for you quickly if you want.
I think that would be a good thing to somehow represent, either graphically or in the numerical, kind of the weighting, if as it were. So most people could see, well, where do most people fall?
Okay.
If it doesn't make it too complicated, I'm just throwing that out for see if it sticks on the wall.
Just bear with me 1 sec, please. Shouldn't take too long.
40 to 50,000 gallons is a typical
All right, so,
That was the-
national number.
Yeah.
And for residential here, it should be very close. The
all right, so,
So that was gonna go, but they're non-septic
Or
irrigation meter.
if there's snowbirds or, you know.
Right, it's gonna be
year-round.
radically different.
Yeah.
So the year-round residential would be in that.
Yeah.
That's the big part.
okay. So, this is telling me, quick math is telling me that the most, so these are broken up in 15,000 intervals right here, up to 60,000, and then after that, we just take everything 60,000 and up. So it's showing that 23% of the accounts have 15,000 or less. Then 20% is between 15 and 30. Then 16 and a half between 30 and 45. 11%, 45 to 60, and then 30% over 60.
It's almost 70%.
Not sure if that really answers your question, Roger, but it's kind of a mishmash.
Yeah, but I think Mike sitting next to me has done some quick math and what, about 70%, what percent?
It looks like it's close to 70%,
Are in the first three
or
groups?
60K and down.
60K and down, under 60.
It's 59% in the first three.
59?
In the first three.
Yeah, and that's 45 and under, right? So those would be your typical residential groupings, I would think. And let me just, something Mike and I were just talking about to kind of say this out loud. I would think the smallest ones would be people who aren't here year round. And then maybe some of those are in that second grouping as well, but then maybe they come more weekends, and then the full timers would probably be in the third grouping, right? 30 to 45. Now, do these match up to your class 1, 2, and 3 that we were seeing on the prior chart, or is this a different grouping?
This is everyone together.
Say that again?
This is all accounts.
Right, but we had class, what I call class 1, 2, and 3. Do these match up to class 1, 2, and 3, what we're looking at on this chart compared to what you were doing in the graphical representation?
Do you mean the user examples that I'm showing in the graphs,
Yeah.
what usage they had? Does that match up with this?
Yeah, do they
Oh,
fit?
yeah.
Do they fit in these ranges? I know they're not going to be. In other words, is the first one under 15,000 or less? Is class 2 between?
Yeah.
We had,
All right. So,
we had 4,
yeah, let me type this up for you.
40, 60, 80, and 1,000.
So
I might have skipped
for
80.
the 1-inch meters, we have a 4,000 example. We have I think it's 19,000. It might be 20. Then we have a 40,000 example. Then we have an 80,000 example, and then we have a 100,000 example.
Right.
Yes, okay.
For the meters that are higher than that, I can look real quick.
What?
So it's 4,020, okay, 40, 80, 100. Okay, and then here we have 19, 104, 117, 5, 6, 8. Okay, so this is actually 20,000. And then for greater than 1 inch, we have 19,000. And then that's the only one that's less than 100,000. The rest are greater than 100,000. Alright, so let me minimize this a little bit so we can see the ranges. Alright, so for the 1-inch meters, the first one, 4,000, does line up with that first one because it's hard to move it here.
It's 15,000 or less, yeah.
And then the 20,000 does fall in that range. The 40,000 does fall in that range. The 80 doesn't. So the 80 and the 100,000 would be here, but the first three do line up. I'll highlight those. They do line up with what we're carrying up to the right here with our quick analysis.
So that's picking up, I think you said before, like 59% of all users, those first three categories.
Yep.
So can you now go back, I'm sorry for this diversion, I'm just trying to sort of get a sense of where do most people fall. Can you go back to that chart that you had comparing the 5 different classes? Or maybe there were 6 different classes, I can't remember. There we go, yeah. And I think the one we ought to be mostly focused on is the FY 20 to 23, because that's going to be the new rate coming in to presumably supplant the interim rate.
Yep.
So we are for residential users of varying amounts that are probably between a little under 200 up to 700. Those relate to the largest users by a factor of, wow, a lot, a factor of 100, right? If you go up to the 89,000. Is my math right there? Yeah, I think it is. If it were 10,
Here.
yeah. If you compare that 89, that must be the Henlopen, right?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it's the only one in that category?
There's another one.
Oh, there is another one? Okay.
The one next to it.
Okay.
20,000.
Okay, so just to sort of get a rough sense of justice here, we'll call it, or equity, we've got those accounts are almost 100 times higher per year than even the largest of the residential. Am I reading that right? Kevin, help me out here if make sure my math's right.
So you're comparing.
I'm comparing the 89 to 693 basically, which picks up all of, 59%. 693 or less picks up 59% of the accounts, which are basically residential accounts of varying sizes, right?
Okay.
Matt, am I interpreting the data correctly, or are you following what I'm saying?
Somewhat following. You're comparing this number to this number.
Yeah, that and the ones smaller than it, yeah. And I'm saying, yeah, if you just compare those two, that's a factor of over 100.
But you have to take into account a single residence versus the number of
Right,
residences in
right.
Henlopen.
So, Bert, do you know how many residences are there in the Henlopen?
I think it's about 125 or 35.
Okay,
So if you take that,
yeah. Because if you just take the 89,546 and divide it by 693, what do you get? It's about 125, isn't it? 100,
I can't do it that
120
fast.
maybe.
130.
129. How about that? And that's probably comparing the residential that are the highest users, because those are more than 40,000, I think we saw, right? So they're probably the residentials that have perhaps multiple units are being rented out. What do you think?
I assume it'd be rented out.
Yeah.
There's no guarantee that that's going to higher usage. However, when you look at some of the data on the individual billing on some of the larger homes, and you compare that to national data, there's a correlation there. So if you've got 9 bedrooms and 10 baths and 2 washrooms, your rate goes up dramatically than if you were a single family with 3 bedrooms and 2 baths.
So are you year-round here now?
Yes.
And you're not renting out? And so what's your annual usage typically?
About 40,000.
About 40. But would that put you in the 693? But, well, you're in the low, you're probably between that and the 413 under this scenario, right?
No, he'd be that 693.
He'd be that 693.
Yeah.
Okay,
Because he's right at 40.
right at 40. Right, that's the 40, not the grouping, yeah. So what does all that mean? That means probably the Henlopen is not generating wastewater of that amount year round, because not everybody's there year round, right? Maybe the condos more, but not the hotel, I wouldn't think.
Well, I had some data in that email I sent today about what the Henlopen's usage was. It was over 5 million, between 5 and 6 million gallons.
Well, it just showed you right there, it's 6.3.
Well, the recent data
Oh.
that I sent out was less than that.
Less than that, yeah. Well, so let me ask you, because, you know, you're year-round,
I took the
does
past
that
12 months.
seem to be in the ballpark, do you think, for what is equitable? When they got 129 users, but they're not year-round. But we're accounting for the fact that they are, you know, we have peak, we have variable cost or non-fixed costs that are there related to their having to serve them in the summer.
Correct.
So even though they're year-round using as much water as a year-rounder times 129, we still have to have a system
Correct.
that accounts for them.
Right.
So to me, that's not way off, I guess is what I would say.
Well, I think in terms of just ballparking it, you're right.
Now, Matt, if you put in the ready to serve factors that you found in the AWWA and you apply that to the wastewater, which I presume you could if we thought that made sense, that's going to skew this more toward the larger users paying more, right?
Yes, if we use it the way that we have it in there, yes, that's correct.
So this is the way it is in the system now. So
Okay.
that Henlopen Hotel pays an annual user, or I guess monthly, so an annual of 383, because it was the 30 whatever times 12. But under the new one, it would pay 106 a month, and it would go to 1274.
So it'd be 12.6 a month times 12 for the annual. Is that what you're saying?
No, those are annuals.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so he's got it per
Okay.
bill, and he's
Okay.
got it annual.
Total revenue is, our rate of serve is yearly.
Correct. And then he divided that by the number of bills to get what it would be an equivalent per bill.
So is that an add-on factor to what, I'm still confused. That's not the total for the, let's see.
So for a 1-inch meter, right now, we're saying $31.95 a bill. So they pay that 4 times, so their annual would be $127.
Okay, I'm with you.
Under the new equivalencies, you can see the 1-inch meter dropped hair, not much.
Mhm.
So it's virtually the same. But now for the other size meters, our methodology had been whatever that ready to serve fee times the number of bills. So each of those 1.5 inch to 4 inch would all pay $383 a year.
Mhm.
Under the equivalent meter philosophy, you can see it goes down a little bit for the 1.5, goes up a little bit for the 2, about doubles for the 3, and then quadruples for the 4-inch and greater. And then
Right, but this is still a very small piece of the
Yes,
overall.
very small and big budget. Because remember,
Yeah.
day one, it was we want to base as much as we can
Right.
on the flow.
Right,
So all
right.
that, it's really based upon how much you're using.
Yeah.
Was kind of the target or the goal.
Can you just leave this up here another minute or two, Matt? I now want to look at, okay, if what it's been So the FY19 bills, which were before any increase, right? Before any increase in rates. The largest user was at 63,000. And 423. What is 63,645 divided by 423.96? Just want to sort of get an idea of the factor there. Okay, so the differential that has been is a little more. And now let's just, for grins, do the interim differential.
It's based on a factor of an increase of the same amount, so that makes sense.
Okay. All right.
Roger, may I ask a question?
Yes, sir.
What are you trying to do? Figure out why it goes from 101 down to 89? Is that kind of?
No, I'm really just trying to compare residential users under the old system that we don't know, just based on meter size, versus the new system and how much, you know, in other words, somebody's going to say, well, is it better or worse for the big users? And it's not, it's maybe a little better when we just compare those two numbers. Now, how about when we compare the 413.28 versus, let's do the comparison in that range. Now, that's the smaller, you know, that could be the one person in a home, or it could be the person who's, you know, heading out of town for 3 months.
The one thing I was trying to get to, Roger, is the number that's in the yellow, the 89.
Yeah.
The reason that falls down so much, whereas if you look at every other user, it doesn't. It kind of stays the same. Is because remember, the ready-to-serve fee that was in place back in 2019 is huge.
Yeah.
On the wastewater 4-inch meter.
Right.
It's like $600 a month versus everything else being,
Right.
you know, and so I think that's the big change there, that you may see that the percentage change from the interim bills to the FY 2023 bill on everybody else is kind of the same. Pretty much so across the board, pretty close. Except
Yeah, it's gone up a little, but yeah, not a lot.
But so until you get to the 4-inch meter, and then that interim bill to the FY 2023 goes down substantially. Even the one at the 1,444,000 right next to it goes from 38 to 20, then back to 32. So that's.
And what you're saying is that most of that was in the ready-to-serve or administrative cost that you know, was being charged monthly.
Yeah, to the wastewater, which is huge relative to the incremental changes in the other. Is when I looked at the numbers, the incremental changes from the old ready-to-serve fee from 1 inch to 1.5 was at a factor of 1.4. From 1 inch to 2 is a factor of 1.8. From 1 inch to 3 was a factor of 2.9. And then when you went to 1 inch to the 4, it exploded.
And to my knowledge, nobody's been able to tell me who came up with those numbers.
No, but they
or the
are,
rationale for
they
them.
are specific on both water and sewer, those rates for from the 1 inch to the 3 inch. And then the 4 inch for the sewers is ballooned versus the 4 inch for the water is not as ballooned. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's helpful to put in perspective. So one of the questions I have, Matt, and it doesn't sound like we've made an adjustment for this, or I'm not saying we need to, but I think when we left last time, particularly on the wastewater, the question was whether GHD or somebody else could give us an opinion about, you know, if we didn't have the size plant that we have, we had what's more the winter flow, would we have lower operating costs in some categories? For example, labor is the one we talked about last time, and maybe that's for you, Ken.
so Bert and I kind of went through that this week, kind of went through that cost allocation table again, made some minor tweaks to it. I don't think there was on the wastewater, or on the water side, there wasn't a lot. Wastewater, we could reduce the staff because we're not producing the extra sludge, we're not hauling and using the Terragator up off campus and all that. So that changed, you know, that was one less person out of 12 is, you know, is a significant number. So we made those adjustments. I think they do reflect in this table though, or in this workbook, don't they, Matt?
Yeah, so Kevin Bird made me aware of the changes they were making. We started on the phone together. I had to leave. So Kevin said that he was going to save a side copy of the workbooks that they were working off of, and I did spend time this week after that to go through and make sure that the changes that they made were in the one I was working off of. So this is reflective of the changes that they made to those cost allocations.
And it wasn't a big change, but it was a change, and probably for the right reasons.
So, and I haven't looked at those for a while, were there any other categories of cost that we ought to think about whether there should be any reduction, or is it only personnel that reasonably could be differential between the size of the plant? Obviously, electricity is a variable already, or non-fixed, so it is what it is. Chemicals, trying to think, what are the other big costs? Personnel is a big cost, right? Big percentage. What else is there anything else that's a big percentage? Matt, can you go back to wastewater operating costs? You know what we're doing, because you weren't here last time, but this came up last time.
I know where you're headed on this, and I had a chance to review some of it, and everything except the capital investment is really linear. There really isn't any interesting incremental changes when you go along and say, "Oop, it jumps up." It's pretty much linear, except for support services and headcount. Everything else, as you were saying with electricity, you don't go to a second rate. That's one thing I was going to ask, because I made an assumption. There used to be dual rates a while back with regard to electricity, and I'm assuming that the city pays a singular rate.
As far as I know, we pay just one.
And that's a big one.
It's not stepped as you get to certain
right.
levels.
And so for some commercial accounts it is, because the power company wants to minimize, if you go to a certain level, it screws up them completely in terms of their generation.
Right.
So if that's true, and your chemicals are purchased, you know, for the year, and that's generally a negotiated rate, so everything with the exception of getting rid of a few people is linear. The biggest, most gigantic expense is the capital that was used to produce the plant that we have. And now you have the debt burden associated with that. So once you've made that commitment, that doesn't go away. So you're left with an infrastructure that if we were Ellendale, we wouldn't need, but we're not Ellendale. And so under that assumption, and what I was looking at as a year-round residential person, I can't say, well, shit, I shouldn't have to pay for any of this stuff. Because the counter to that is, the reason we have what we have in Rehoboth Beach, which isn't intuitively obvious, is the emergency services, the police, et cetera, the scale of what we have, the 911 center, for example, is only here because of the scale that occurs because of what happens over the summer and other things. So it isn't a direct situation where you can foist off and say, well, I shouldn't have to pay for this because if we were Ellendale, I wouldn't have all these other expenses. Well, I also have all those other benefits. Now, there's a counter to that a little bit that says, well, yeah, but when you have all this peak flow that's occurring in the summer that's caused by all these visitors, there's a whole bunch of other costs that we as taxpayers have to pick up that they don't contribute to. That's part of that milieu, and that's a policy decision of what the hell you come up with for the numbers.
Yeah.
So I guess that's what I was looking at, is there's everything related to, as you were looking at in terms of labor and chemicals, et cetera, is purely linear. Use more, pay more, use less, pay less, and it doesn't change much. It's the infrastructure cost itself.
Yeah, and that shows up in the future years when the debt burden increases. Matt, this is helpful here, but there was another chart you had that showed the breakout of the various categories of operating costs by amount and percentage. You know, you pick your year, you can pick last year or.
You can actually see dollar amounts? Is that what you're getting at?
I couldn't understand you. Say it again?
You want to see dollar amounts? Because that's what this one is.
Yeah, that's it. Okay. So salaries, wait a minute, fixed, non-fixed, yeah, projected expense. So if our overall I'm just trying to see what are the other big categories of expense. We've got salaries, we've got overtime. Again, this doesn't pick up chemicals and electricity. The one that, this is,
Scroll down, it will.
oh, okay,
Head down.
okay. Oh, yeah, okay. So chemicals, 200,000. What's the total, not here, about, is it 2 million? Bert, for wastewater, or not that high?
Total what?
Total expenses?
Yeah.
For the whole, yeah, in $2 million range.
2 million, so, yeah, 2.16. So, and now can you scroll back up and just, now that I have what the denominator is, trying to figure out what's the percentage, what are the three big tickets? We know labor is one. And you've
Especially
basically.
when you consider all the things that are tied to that, the insurance. the medical,
Right.
and all that.
Right, so that's, wow, that in the, yeah,
Medical
all that stuff is
insurance.
well over half, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
And the next big one is chemicals at 200? And we're accounting for that, as you say, that's linear. And what's the other big one? What's electricity? Oh, there's electricity, and that's linear, okay. What's general maintenance? Yeah, what's that consist of?
Well, that's gonna include all the, basically the parts that they use, in the plant, any kind of repairs,
Is that strictly the plant, or is it also the pump stations and
it's
collection
gonna be the
system?
whole system.
Everything, okay. I mean, somebody could say, if you had an Ellendale plant, would you need that much maintenance? And that's a question maybe I have for Kevin or somebody who knows more about your
Well,
system.
And that's why we split, so we still split it at about a 60-40.
Oh, okay, you've already split that one, okay, good. Any others above 100,000? I didn't see
I
any
think there was
others.
another one, let's go farther down a little bit. I thought there was one more. Oh, the reserve. fund.
Reserve, yeah. So how are we allocating the reserve?
Based on flows. In other words, we have a year-end agreed upon procedures where we look at the flows of the 4 entities and actual, what we'll do, we'll apply the percentages with some tweaks and decide how much each entity has to contribute up to the max. So you're always, the actual agreement was 50,000 a year. I think what we have there is we have 2 in 1 year, but,
But in terms of allocating that among
we left it
peak
all.
versus non-peak,
We had it all.
it's all based on flows.
all based on flow, so that's all fixed, basically. Let me think about that, does that make sense?
I mean, the bottom line is, once you walk away from the capital investment, you're back into this linearity where peak versus non-peak almost becomes an irrelevant consideration from the standpoint of what you're looking at in terms of cost. Because what's been done is a fully loaded cost model. So you've allocated everything related to it. And so it ends up being predominantly linear, and the monster in the room is the capital investment,
Right.
debt service.
Yeah, and one thing when I say this thing's largely allocated on flows, there's a whole lot of tweaks to it. I mean, we've got a report that's about 30 pages that, we prepare for our auditors. And there are a lot of things like a capital item that you may buy. Let's say you buy a pump station, you buy a new pump for a pump station. If one of the entities doesn't use that pump, we don't allocate them for that. So it's all done in an effort to be fair, because at Dewey Beach, for example, doesn't use the main pump station, and Lopen Acres does. So that if there's an allocation for, we're not gonna hit Dewey Beach or something that they don't use.
Right. Okay, I think this satisfies, I mean, I just want to make sure by doing what we did to address the one less employee, there wasn't something else we were overlooking or weren't at least making a conscious decision about. But it seems to me, I'm back to Mike, it's pretty much everything else is linear. So I think we've made a reasonable concession on the employee front, because that's the big ticket as far as operation costs go. And I think on the other stuff, just to sort of bring back what we've done weeks ago, you went out to GHD on the capital side and got a breakout from them as to how to allocate the capital costs going forward, including the cost of the outfall, based on fixed versus non-fixed. And where are those numbers again? It's been so long since I looked at those. Are they right there?
53, 47 for basically the wastewater treatment plant upgrades. And then the outfall was at 96 and 4.
Yeah, you did. Are you comfortable with what the breakouts there? I mean, we're based on what the engineers say. We don't know better, but
We went through that, just a few weeks ago, we
Yeah.
talked about that.
Yeah.
And from the standpoint of a risk analysis and trying to determine what is a fair and reasonable estimate, because you still don't know what the future holds, but you try to give it the best shot you can. And based on that engineering analysis, based on Kevin's comments and Bert's, just from what we know from history, it seemed reasonable.
Yeah. I mean, the thing on the capital side that I hadn't focused on at first, and a lot of people who look at this the first time, they say, well, you're not putting enough of the cost. You got this big system, you're not putting enough of the cost on the big users. The reality is, except for these new expenses, the system is paid for with grants and prior bond issues. So, we sort of come into this process with a lot of inherited asset value, if you follow what I'm saying.
Correct.
Certainly we got to do the upgrades, but when you consider I don't know what the total, do you do that in your report by any chance? Is there an asset value attached to the existing facilities? Is there any reason to do that?
Is there an asset value to the existing? Well, yeah, we have fixed asset calculations. We know how much we've got invested. Every time we're making investments annually, we're going to add that to our schedule. Is that what you're asking?
Yeah. So, and again, I don't want to get into the weeds here, but something you might want to have handy to help explain that is maybe even with these capital investments that we now have to pay off, that maybe only represents a third or 25% of the overall finished value of the system, because we've got all this infrastructure, pipes, pumping stations, basic treatment plant that are there and paid off, right? So there's a lot of value in that. And yeah, we're having to raise rates now because of the new stuff, but part of the good news for people who've been here for a while, because they got grants, because they came and inherited a system that was paid off largely, they've got the benefit of that. So that means now we're having to raise rates to, fund the new stuff.
There's, you kind of brought up an interesting point, because, when you're allocating these new costs, since everything was purchased with debt pretty much, then rather than look at the fixed asset piece, you look at the debt load and use that as your guideline, because that really represents what all these new costs were.
Yeah. Because you don't have debt for the old stuff, it's paid for.
Exactly. So the fair, I guess what I'm saying, the fair allocation is to look at the debt piece, because 100% of what we've done was purchased with debt. So that pretty well is equivalent to, that's equivalent to what you actually spent.
Yeah. And the good thing the city's doing, it seems to me, is you're not putting it off on future users, paying a lot more interest, and ultimately paying a lot more than, people are now having to, pipers come to pay for these things. And yeah, there might be a softer way to do it if you spread it way out, but ultimately you're gonna pay a lot more because of the interest. And who knows then what you've got to replace and upgrade again. So I think the city's to be commended for wanting to, sort of pay as you go on this, which is the city's always done. There's a precedent for that.
Well, we've always had very short amortization schedules on debt. This recent, the recent improvements like the Lynch Well, that was the first really long-term piece of debt that we took out. Long-term meaning 20 years or over. And this debt we're taking is going to be one part of the bond is 25 years, the other's 20. So
it really isn't pay as you go. It's
yeah, but I think the idea of it is you should finance an asset for its useful life. Otherwise,
yeah.
if you finance it for longer than its useful life, you're passing on a burden to the future generation.
Right. And I guess the counter to, the flip side of that is if you try to pay it all down too quickly, you're burdening the earlier users over.
That's exactly right.
The ones that are still to come or, okay. What do you guys want to do next?
I have one thing when you get it ready to serve fee.
Yeah, let's talk that now.
I sent some numbers out this morning, and I looked at the 3 buildings, the Atlantic Sands, the Henlopen, and One Virginia, and I looked at the 12 most recent months. Matt doesn't have this data because mine's a little fresher, but I took 12 months. Those units used 13,219,000 gallons for a year. And with the Atlantic Sands, we had as 6.9, One Virginia's 1.2, Henlopen's a little over 5 million. And so what I did is I went ahead and used 40,000 as what I said an average annual user would use and divided it into that to get what might be considered the equivalent unit. Well, Matt's schedule, and I thought that was a good schedule that he had, but it kind of made me, his schedule showed like the 4-inch meters would be equivalent to like 20 single-family dwellings, if I understood that right, Matt. And I guess the point of all this is that, you got one thing to consider is that there is commercial units in some of these properties. There's commercial, so it's not just the individual condos that are in there. You've got like a restaurant at the top of the Henlopen and there and all that. But basically, if you divided 40,000 into I forget which one I used, whether it was the Atlantic Sands, you get a much higher number of equivalent units. You get like 300. So what the point of this is, are we being unfair to the single family resident? Because by saying that, and I know Matt just pulled the chart, so Matt, I'm not being critical at all, but what I'm saying is...
But it was an industry chart, it wasn't, Matt didn't come up with the numbers.
No, he just introduced the idea, but only thing I'm saying is I question the industry chart, because if 24-inch meters are equal to one-inch meter, that doesn't, it's not supported by our numbers, because the actual usage in those is much higher. And I would say that the ready to serve fee basically should be, there's justification for it to be a lot higher, because you've got the equivalent of 300 units in the one that I checked. I think it was the Atlantic Sands. So I know when I first looked at this the old, what you call maintenance fee, ready to serve, it was over $600 a month. People said, well, gee, that's terrible. But my point of it is, compare that to, if you look at the usage and then you compare that to single family, that $600 a month doesn't seem to be all that unreasonable. If you're looking at, you know, and
What are we trying to fund with the rate to serve, I guess is the question.
well, yeah.
Isn't that the old administrative cost?
Well, that's what the old administrative cost was, basically billing, and I don't know that they really, it was so low that I don't think it really probably was considering, you know, what you've been talking about all along, Roger, which is building the plant to a certain capacity to serve everybody. But my idea, well, is if an individual unit at Henlopen, and I guess you'd have to go to more than just the individual condos, you'd have to throw the commercial properties in there. I'm just saying there's a case to be made for a higher ready-to-serve fee for these condo buildings, because all the condo association does is divide the number of units by, that they have some kind of metric. I'm sure they charge the commercial units more and all, but they have some kind of measure where they're, you know, essentially dividing the ready-to-serve fee by the number of users. So it comes down.
It kind of goes against what our thought was, to try to recover the administrative costs. So that's really not that much based on flow.
Well,
you're saying
because
that
you're
using-
sending one bill to the Henlopen versus
Right.
300 units.
And you're reading 1 meter.
Right.
And you're reading 1 meter.
See, from the start, we I think concluded we wanted to try to, from a fairness standpoint, tie things to flow, and again to try to allocate for whether it was fixed or non-fixed, based on also on flow, to take into account the peaking issue. So but maybe if I'm understanding what you're saying, Bert, what we're doing though is we're coming back and we're saying, okay, we've already done all that, but now we're gonna add this extra charge on. And we're gonna base it on something, either size of meter or proportionality of flow. And I guess I'm okay with that if we can isolate what that represents in terms of actual expense, and that expense then should be based on those proportions. But I don't know what expense is it just a cost we're adding on, or a fee we're adding on, I should say?
You made a good point there, but one expense is you're reading a meter and billing them 12 times a year versus 4 times a year.
Okay.
Maybe not a significant expense, but
Well, you're sending them more bills, but, so if somebody's doing a administrative task and sending it out in the mail, but again, how significant is that, I guess is the question.
probably not that significant. But how about the cost of the meter itself when it has to get replaced?
Yeah, well, I think you made a good point on that last time. We talked about, I know it's not that way under the city code, but perhaps making an adjustment to the code that would say that the users would pay for the cost of replacement of the meter. Did we ever conclude whether legally you could do that?
I'm not sure, because see, we do have the water cap fee. In other words, when somebody buys a new system,
Right.
in theory, that's supposed to cover the cost of that. But if you only pay that one time,
Right.
So, you know, of course, I would bet that Henlopen Hotel's meter's probably never been changed since the 70s, but I don't know that for a fact. So in one respect, it may be good, but if something happened and you had to replace the meter several times, you haven't covered your costs with the water cap fees.
Well, the question I have is the code specific enough right now to preclude you from doing that as a billing policy, we'll call it?
I don't know the answer to that, Roger. I have to go back and read what the water.
So I think your point's well taken. I think that's, you know, because of the high differential between the costs of meters, that should be a cost borne by the user. That seems fair to me, rather than it's spread among the whole system.
Yeah, and we don't.
You know what we're talking about there?
Yeah.
You weren't last time, but there's a huge difference between replacing a 4-inch meter versus a 1-inch meter.
Oh, yeah.
Who would have thought? But it is.
I don't know. I don't even know what that. Do you know what that number is, Kevin? for
No, it's in
forage?
our fee sheet.
No, I mean, as far as actually going out and buying one. I mean, are they $50,000 or?
For a forage, I don't know.
I think the larger issue that you brought up, Bert, is when you look at all the systems around the country, and you look at how they approach these various things, there's a multitude of ways of doing this. And we don't use an inclining block system. We have a singular fee, fully costed out. You use X, you pay Y. And about 50 to 60% of the systems have moved to inclined blocks. We may go there next time. But the inclining block addresses a whole bunch of intangibles. As the use goes up, more money goes into the system to pay for it. It's the same water, the same sewer, same everything, but it goes up, and the factors go up by 10 to 1, 8 to 1, 7 to 1. It's very dramatic within the residential commercial space, and industrial space gets even more. But in this case, since we don't have inclining block and we have a singular cost per gallon, so to speak, you're left with sort of an intangible factor here that what Bert was commenting on is that if you looked as a single family residential year-round, that's all it is, and you look at the quote burden that they'll absorb vis-a-vis the Henlopen or something, the Henlopen actually doesn't pay anywhere near in that one-to-one example of what the single family residential user would pay for ready to serve on a per unit basis when you try to make that equivalence. But yet at the same time, you were talking about what Matt had suggested, didn't seem to get a good correlation.
Well, Roger's point was, I knew that he was going to jump on this when I was using the usage as a criteria. And because there's a valid argument there that, you know, the way I did it by dividing the 40,000 in there, somebody could argue that, well, is that really costing the system more money? You know, I don't know. But, you know, I do think that what you just said might make sense in that, you know, usage does come into play in all that to some degree. And I don't know how to quantify that right now, but I mean, I do think that if the Henlopen's using as much as they're using and they have a ready to serve fee for each individual homeowner that comes out to about $2 or $3, then I don't think that's fair.
Right, when you look at the individual user ready to pay fee is
Yeah.
dramatically different. And that, therein lies the rub. I mean, that's, how do you, is the single family residential user paying too much? And therefore that should come down, and so there's equivalence across the board on a per user basis. And that would then reflect in your totality of billing as an entity. So, it's,
The concern I have is we try to develop what I would call a fairly pure flow-based model that does take into account the peaks because of the non-fixed cost. We still need to come up with a way of explaining that, but I'm convinced that inherent in the one rate figure we have is taking into account peaks because of what we've just been through. And my concern, Bert, is that then if we add this new fee on, it's sort of like doubling down. What I drew comfort from is when we went to the analysis and we compared the Henlopen to the larger residential, 40,000. And we looked at the differential in the annual rate, the annual cost, the annual billed amount in the first 4 years under the system, under wastewater. Have to bring this down. So when you made that comparison, it was 129 times higher for the Henlopen than it was for that residential at 40,000. And somebody said, maybe it was you, that there's 125 units at the Henlopen. And you have a restaurant, which I don't even think is open, but it hadn't been recently. But in any event, what that tells me is the Henlopen is paying, you know, a little more than the equivalent units if you said one of their units was 40,000. But when you think about it, they're not there all year round in one of those units, and a lot of those units probably aren't using as much as a single family residence. It may during certain times of the year.
Well, the
But
numbers, yeah.
so let me finish. So what I was gonna say is, if I was the Henlopen and I said, wow, I'm paying, 129 times what a 40,000 user is, and my people are only here, maybe 5 months, 6 months, whatever the average might be, am I paying too much? But you're probably not, because we've accounted for you covering some peak costs, operating costs, and going forward, the differential is gonna be probably more because of trying to pick up these additional capital costs. So in my mind, it kind of passed the straight face test in terms of, is this the right proportionality? Yeah, they're gonna get a little less than they would if we had kept the system the same way it is, or it has been, based on the cost per meter size, but we could find no justification for that. So I mean, I'm comforted that we're in the ballpark with our methodology. It may not be easy to explain to people, but I think we've got it about right. And my concern is if we add on sort of this other ready-to-serve thing, and we don't have an actual cost that's being applied to, and backing that cost out of the rest of our stuff, where we could, people could say, well, how does that work? What's your rationale for that? And I think we've lost a little of the purity of the system we try to come up with. So.
Well, I hear that, and just to throw something back, is if I'm using, and you don't know how many gallons you're using in a Henlopen condo, because there's only one bill, I realize that, but let's say somebody does live there, and they're using 20,000 gallons a year, and somebody else has a single family dwelling, and they're using 20,000 gallons a year, would you agree that each of them should have about the same total bill?
No, because the Henlopen is peak, whereas the other one has more fixed. And we didn't make that comparison. We were using the 40,000 versus the Henlopen, and it was 129 times. I think if we'd have used the 20,000, it would have been, I don't know, 140 or 50 times.
Can I make an observation? Using the term peak and non-peak right now actually is irrelevant.
Yeah, it's confusing.
And we shouldn't use it.
Yeah, you're right.
We've created a fully loaded cost model that's based on per gallon flow, period. Turns out there's peaks, there's valleys, it's all over the place. However, and using the example that both Bert and you are using as the Henlopen, for the sake of argument, to try to make a point, let's assume that the Henlopen, one user uses 99% of that total consumption, and the other 120 residences don't use anything, okay? That's a problem for the Henlopen in and of itself. We bill based on usage. That's how much was used. If the tenants want to argue among themselves and say, wait a minute, why the hell are you using 6 million gallons a year and we're only using 3 or 2 or 1? They have to deal with that because we deal with one bill. So where I'm going with this is, the first part was I don't think peak or non-peak has anything to do with this. It's a fully loaded cost model. However, I agree with you. If we have a ready-to-serve fee to deal with ready-to-serve, we would have to back it off from our totality of cost, saying, look, this is something we're going to put in there fixed because there's so many irregularities in the future. We have no idea what's going on. So there's a standard ready-to-serve fee whether or not you use anything, period. You pay this amount. And I think it can be justified if it's backed out of the total. So it's a ready-to-serve fee based on a whole bunch of unknowns. And we come up with that dollar value. And that ends up being X dollars per equivalent residence. Now, the suggestion was made that, and I looked at the numbers as well, of going with something that's a function of meter size. There's a lot of things that are handled that way. And in fact, that's one of the approaches that's been taken as opposed to using the inclining block. It actually is based on meter size. You could use the exact same amount of flow and you pay more if you have a 4-inch meter. You pay less if you have a 3, less if you have a 2, less if you have a 1. So all of those are philosophies that are used around the country. And at least based on my research, I can't figure out if one's better than the other. They're just different. And what's acceptable to a community has to make some kind of rational sense. And we've opted to go with the full flow, fully costed model so that we have a baseline that, to your point, Roger, I think is important. We absolutely can defend the baseline number. Somebody may say they think things should be different based on the scale of things, but we have a solid baseline number. So then the question is, do we add or subtract something from that and parceling it out strictly from a cost standpoint for this ready-to-serve fee? I think what you're saying is it shouldn't be additive because we did what we did
Yeah,
this way.
we've already taken into account.
Right. If there's a need to have a ready-to-serve fee, then it should be developed in a way that we think it makes some kind of sense. And I
Actual expense is tied to something.
Right,
That then
right.
you allocate.
say, look, you know, regardless of what happens, there's gonna be $900,000 a year that we may have to spend regardless of what's going on. So therefore, here's the ready-to-serve. Bingo, and it's justified. And it's backed out of the number we have, and that we recalculate it, so the per gallon basis comes out to be X, and that's the standard that you run with. The same thing from the standpoint of reconnect fees or whatever we want to come up with or don't come up with. And that would seem to be fully defensible. And then that fee is a function of meter size. Smaller meters are easier to deal with than bigger meters. And there's a whole bunch of data out there with regard to, quote, costs on that. Maybe that's the solution. So that way it ends up being fair and equitable no matter where you are, whether you're a 1 inch or a 4 inch. And, you know, and to your point, we don't then we don't have to deal with the argument that would ensue, or as Bert's point, the argument that would be, well, this is unfair. Why the hell am I paying the same ready-to-serve fee that Henlopen is, and they use 6 million gallons versus my 40,000 a year?
So Bert, what elements of cost do you envision the ready-to-serve that would be allocated to that? If we get backed them out of the cost we have in, to use Mike's term, the fully loaded flow-based model, what would we back out and assign based on meter that would sort of relate to something in the meter? The one thing I've heard you say is if we have to replace the meter, that's certainly and that seems like it's a big differential, but in terms of just sending monthly bills or reading it, I guess the question is how much difference in cost is that?
Well, and yeah, your point's good in the sense that we send 12 bills to the guy who's got the 1.5 inch meter as well as the guy who's got the 4 inch meter.
Yeah. So how do you distinguish that?
You've got an inequity there. But what Mike was saying there, and I can't say, Kevin might be able to comment on that, but I mean, is there more service requirement with with larger meter size? One of the things that we've talked about is I don't know that those meters have ever been calibrated, and whether we're going to start a system where we actually do some audits of 10% of our meters a year, have some kind of system, because, you know, I've caught meters that haven't been in use, that haven't been spinning for a year and a half, and so the customer's not been getting a bill for a year and a half.
They haven't come in and complained about that?
No. But my point of it is I think the city's going to be in a better position to catch all that stuff too. But I mean, but as far as maintenance cost, I don't know what it costs. You're going to have a third-party company come in and calibrate the meters at the condominiums, and there's big money there. So if we haven't, you know, I was just looking at the numbers today. I was thinking, well, how come one Virginia only uses 1.2 million gallons, and the Henlopen uses 5, and the Atlantic Sands uses almost 7?
But if we go down that rabbit hole, Bert, I think we will never go anywhere, because you could make that claim on any of those 20,000 bills or 2,300 bills, because that particular house that year was under construction and didn't use anything. And now the new house is 8 bedrooms and has a swimming pool. But on that particular table, that year that we used, it's 0. So, you know, we chase our tails forever.
Well, I'm not talking
trying
about
to bring every particular bill address up to the most recent
No, I'm just
Not something
comparing
like that.
3 comparable type of commercial structures. I'm not talking about individual 1-inch
But you don't know,
meters.
is one wing being constructed?
Well, I can tell you one thing, if one's using 2 million, another's using 6, and they're essentially the equivalent size of building, some curiosity's getting piqued.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. It could be a meter issue there.
That's what I'm saying, and this is, I mean, what I was talking about, the importance, well, I didn't mean to get into that individual discussion.
If
but
you're
what I was
gonna,
talking
if
about-
you're
That's a
gonna
good
check,
point.
if you're gonna check meters, you start with the big ones.
Yes, that's where I'm going. I'm saying,
Yeah.
And-
well, it would cost very little, and maybe we find out that the one Virginia isn't working right. Because it's a third of what the other ones
Yeah.
are.
Yeah, that's a good point.
Well, that's a very good point about the ready-to-serve fee, as an example of what you might want to do across the board. If we don't go with a ready-to-serve fee, because we have fully allocated all costs, we could come up with a ready-to-serve fee that reflects.
We went down this road 2 months ago.
Yeah,
right?
I know.
And we said, okay, we wanted to have a set fee of
Right.
some sort, because if all the flow goes away, you still got certain things you gotta do. And we came up with the idea of let's identify the administrative costs. We went down that road, we identified those, we split them based upon what we determined to be fixed, non-fixed, and we put a number to it. We came up with that number, we backed that out of the big, cost table.
Right,
So we did this.
right. And
But wasn't the problem that arose is how it was being applied? Because when you applied it monthly, it was really ramping up the
So
larger.
that was the
users.
discussion, 2 weeks ago or
Yeah.
a week and a half ago.
And that's why we kind of took it out,
Was
right?
we haven't taken it out.
It's still there.
It's still there.
Okay, all right.
Was hitting those, because somebody came up with the idea, well, as a 20,000 gallon user, residential 1-inch meter, should they be paying the equivalent of a 20,000 gallon 2-inch meter? And they weren't, because you're hitting the ready-to-serve fee 12 times instead of 4 times.
Yeah.
We said, well, is that fair? Well, and that case could be made either way.
So that's still in these numbers right now?
Correct, because
Okay.
you're still billing them, you're having to read the meter once a
Right.
month instead of once a quarter, you're having to send them all those. Maybe it takes a little longer to work on a 2-inch meter if you get in there, and it costs more to replace it if you have to replace it. So at that point, it was like, well, okay, maybe it makes sense to hit them 12 times instead of just 4. Well, and I thought that Matt's idea of going back to AWWA and using what they recommended, you make an equivalent meter. And in our case, because the vast majority are 1-inch, most of them fall in that range. But then you do distribute a little bit more based on there is some size component in there because a 4-inch meter is more equivalent units than a 1-inch meter. So it kind of takes that into consideration that, it is more expensive to work on, more expensive to replace, those kinds of things. But not that we're trying to base it on flow, because we have that already once. And if we try to do that again, then I think
So you were taking the administrative costs, which is what? The billing, got the meter reading, the billing?
So hit the other tab, if you would there, Matt, administrative cost allocation. So we did the same philosophy. We said, okay, what is the administrative cost associated with running the program? So in that case, it's, so we include stuff like those employees' vacation days because they're not working. The superintendent spends 50% of his day dealing with me, so he's not fixing anything, so he gets a little bit more of an administrative charge. And we did that with all of the same breakout of costs that we had on the initial cost allocation.
And so when we apply the flow-based number to this, those costs are not in there, or are they still in there on the flow-based?
They're pulled out of.
Pulled out, okay.
Yeah, or
So
they,
we're not
or
double-
I don't know whether they're pulled out or added in as additional revenue. Matt can tell us that, I'm
So
sure.
we're not double counting this.
No.
No, and so, based on Bert's observation, though,
Matt, you still with us?
Philip,
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Sorry.
based on Bert's observation
Yeah.
of equivalent residences, in our current model with the fees that would be charged, someone could say, well, look, the Henlopen on a per residence basis isn't paying anywhere near what I, as a single family person, was paying. However, I think the counter defense against that is they have a 4-inch meter, and if we were to go with something here, and we say that the ready to serve fee is X because they have a 4-inch meter, it becomes coincidental, and the people that live in the Henlopen are just lucky that they don't pay as much as I do, quote, for the ready to serve fee. On the other hand, they're also not a single family residential that sits on a lot all by itself that's fully owned by the individual. It's not part of a condo association. So it's a different kind of residence. And I think
There's certain efficiencies that
Yeah,
are
there's-
inherent with that. I
Right.
understand.
And so it's also a difference in perspective, I guess. It's because it's contained with a whole bunch of other residences. It's an apartment type complex, even though they are condos, as opposed to a single family individual residence. At that point of discussion, I think it gets into just a difference of opinion, and it's difficult to come to an absolute accounting analysis that says, why is this more than that? Because the characteristics are very different, even though, quote, the flow is the same. The surrounding characteristics are different. So I'm leaning more towards what you were just saying, Kevin, in that, yes, it would be different. Because it is a 4-inch meter, it probably should be a ready-to-serve fee that's bigger than a 3, than a 2, than a 1. Matt's idea, what was in the manual, the others that I have seen, try to get some kind of parity because of the different size in the pipe, basically. I think that's fair. But I think you're correct, Bert. Someone who in the Henlopen or someone that isn't in the Henlopen could say, why am I paying? And I think the defense of that is exactly the one that I just stated, perhaps not too as well articulated as I would have liked. They're different.
Well, if I'm living in the Henlopen, the argument I would make is, I'm 125 or whatever the units are. I don't have the same amount of distribution line or collection line or manholes that the 125 homes out on how many blocks take up. I'm a more, to use your term, I'm a more efficient user overall. But I'm also probably more of a, and I know you don't want to hear this word, peak user. So I'm more of a I'm contributing more to that non-fixed because you have to build everything for me to be there, when I'm there in the summer. Let's, and I agree with you, it gets confusing to use peak and non-peak, but last time, and I think this is going to happen again, people, because we've had a peak and non-peak, and now we're not calling it that, people are thinking that, so now the big summer users are going to get a much better break, and it's not fair, which I can understand why they would say that. But inherent in our flow-based is this concept of the non-fixed costs, which are being carried more by the larger users. So it's not called peak anymore. But it's really, isn't it related to those non-fixed costs that are being allocated based on, and Matt, help me out here, as I recall, those are based on the peak 2 quarters of flow. It's being allocated on that basis. Am I correct?
So yeah,
What did you say, yes?
right here.
Oh, he's showing.
Oh, you're showing us, okay, yeah. So before we get into the weeds on this, is it fair to say, Matt, that although we're not calling it peak and non-peak, the higher flows during the peak period, which are the 2 quarters that consume the summer and shoulder seasons, we are allocating higher costs to those, we're allocating non-fixed costs on a greater basis to the people who are using it in those periods of time. And therefore, even though we're not calling it peak and non-peak, inherent in our flow-based system is the principle of allocating to peak flows. Let me stop there and ask if that sounds right and accurate.
Yeah, it sounds right to me.
You follow what I'm saying? Say it again.
I think I got you. But,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I know that's been a big concern of people. We're recommending a rate that doesn't have a peak and non-peak, and they've always had that. And that gave people comfort that, okay, the summer people are carrying their fair share. We heard that a lot last week and maybe the session before. I don't think you were here. So I think we have to come up with a way, you even suggested, how do we explain that when our system does, when our approach, our methodology does take peak flows into account? Because what we're doing, we're assigning the non-fixed cost, the variable costs. They're tied more to the period of the year when you use more water, generate more wastewater. We're assigning those based on the flows, the usage during the 2 peak quarters. So that component of the cost is really a peak factor. Help me out, Matt. My wording may not be right here, but in my mind, I can wrap around it. It might not be that I can explain it. Maybe you should. Why don't you give a shot at it, Matt?
Okay. All right, so I'll do it from my angle and tell me if this meshes with what you're thinking, Roger. So the methodology behind the fixed costs are costs that the city incurs because they run, in this case, a wastewater system year-round. Those costs that exist irregardless of the fact that there is a peak season. So basically, let's think about what the cost would be if there wasn't an uptick in flow because of the peak season. Those are what we're considering our fixed costs. The non-fixed costs are everything else, or costs that are incurred to the city because there is that uptick in flow or because there is that high season. So it makes sense to tie peak flow to those costs because those costs are related to that additional flow.
So the non-fixed costs, if I understand the model correctly, Matt, the non-fixed are being allocated based on peak flow during the 2 quarters that the city's always considered the peak flow quarters for purposes of billing, whereas the fixed costs are allocated based on year-round flow.
Correct.
So there is an element of peaking in there.
You can see the numbers right here in front of you. There's your peak flow number of gallons. There's your non-peak flow, and there's your total.
Right, but the result of that, though, is it's linearized throughout the entire flow.
Well, it ultimately becomes linearized because you have one value per 1,000 gallons.
Right.
But in coming up with that number, there's 2 components to that number. There's a fixed and a non-fixed.
Right.
And the non-fixed is really similar, or it's trying to take into account the fact that you've got the peak flows, and we've got certain costs that vary based on the peak flows. And so we're putting them into that bucket, and we get another bucket that is fixed costs that doesn't change based on the time of year. For example, the labor all but 1 person. And all those costs are being assigned based on the fixed flow that would be there, to use the Allendale.
Right.
So is everybody comfortable with, number 1, doing that? And then the second question is, how do we best explain that? Because it's a little dense. Mayor, are you following us on this? And
Absolutely.
Commissioner Sharp? It's
I don't know if you have to go that deep.
okay.
I think the
You go on typos, Mark.
I think the public, whether we call it peak or non-peak or
No,
whatever.
I'm trying to pry. I just wondered you were doing a lot.
There was, as you said, previously they were used to seeing that.
Yeah.
But I think the overriding part of this, which has become more in the public's consciousness, is they didn't in the past, up until the last few years, appreciate the fact that there was a looming debt load that was, even though it was in the bill previously, to try to account for it, just how much that would result in. And now we see that in terms of the debt that we have. And so I think that totality of debt, the public is really becoming more cognizant of it and realizing it as they've seen more of it over the last year or two. And I think that's what people are reacting to, which then gets to the fact that, well, why do I have to pay because, and some tension within the folks. I think that tension is going to be hard, no matter how we analyze this, no matter which way we do it. The bottom line is costs are going up.
Right, for everybody.
And that is a reality. Then the question becomes, I think, can we explain it rationally that says this is the reality? And the other part is, which we haven't gotten into at all, which I don't think is appropriate for us, as Bert pointed out a couple meetings ago. All this does is fully absorb the cost of the system. It doesn't take into account the fact that currently in other aspects of the city functioning, profit, quote unquote, above these costs contributed to other services that are essential for all of that influx that occurs over 4 to 5 months during the year. And we're not, beg pardon?
That needs some profit, that's right.
Yeah, but that,
My whole model for
when it
budgeting
moves,
is messed up.
when it moves to that is a policy decision that isn't for us to determine. We've established, and I think appropriately so, the baseline cost of what it costs to run the system and to keep the system and to stay solvent. And I think the staying solvent and also providing some degree of planning ability for the city and for the public is we opted for that 4-year window that says, look, things are going to be consistent here. It does go up here, it goes up, goes down, I forget the out years. But in looking at other municipalities, that seemed to be a very good approach. You try to lock it in so people can plan, so you don't get jerked around going up and down, mostly up. So I think that made rational sense. So we've established a baseline, but there's still that next piece of this puzzle. And I think it probably needs to be said, because I think with the what we're doing and what we're presenting, I think people might look at it and say, oh, that's what my new bill is going to be. Nah, not necessarily.
So one thing that we did last week or week before, when we were discussing the whole idea of the profit center and contribution to the general fund, Matt has set up on the water workbook the ability to enter a value for contribution to the general fund. So if Bert says it's $500,000 a year, then we can punch that in and see what that does. Because you're right, that
It can become part of the budget
Yeah,
planning
absolutely.
process, and the commissioners can have input, on that, how much we want to budget for that, and then we can just put that in, and the rate will be increased.
Has there been an implicit, excuse me, has the profitability, if you will, from water and wastewater, from the billings, has it previously been allocated to other functions specifically? Or it's just treated as a totality against the total budget in terms of a profit?
Well, it evolves based upon just how the accounting system functions, in the sense that we have one central collection point for money. And so all the sewer revenues really go into one account. And what happens is the system automatically tracks an obligation. In other words, if we collected $100,000 today for the sewer department, the system will automatically create an obligation from the general fund to the wastewater fund. It says we collected $100,000 a year. We sent out bills. So we collected, X point, whatever that number is. But we also recognize that there's an obligation to that. So that's how these transfers actually get made. It's a little technical for the public, but I mean, basically, it's a good tracking system. And but in answer to your question, Mike, no, it's not planned. It just evolves.
Okay. Because it seems to me it's a it is a critical consideration for the policy piece of this when we're done, for Tony and you and Mr. Mayor, is the contribution that is essential from what this totality is to contribute to all the other services that are needed to support those peaks, which has nothing to do with peak flow, but has to do with peak services, waste, trash collection, boardwalk maintenance, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, you're right, Mike, and essentially what's changed here is our mission here is to figure out how to cover the costs for the water
Right.
department.
Period.
Okay, well, that's all we're doing, but at the same time, we're gonna probably, in our budgeting going forward, have to identify how much contribution we
To
can
get
make. And we can look at, I mean, I prepared, I don't know whether you saw a worksheet, it was like 11 years worth of transfers. And basically, it showed how much money has been coming out of these enterprise funds to support the general government. And over an 11-year period, you're talking about $7 million. So, I mean, it's, I guess what I'm really, what I'm concerned about as a finance person, I've given up on the water department, a wastewater department, as far as its ability to contribute, because we can't charge anymore. So we can't really plan for profit in wastewater, because it's got all it's going to do to carry its own load. Before, when we had a free plant that was generating cash,
Right.
it was great. But it's out of the equation now. So we've got the water department left, and its business model is essentially the same as what it was. We've got some capital items planned in the future, but it still has the capability of contributing to the general fund.
Right.
And
Yes, I think that's, yes, that's important, and I appreciate that.
otherwise, I mean, if you don't do it that way, you've got to have another source of revenue.
Right.
And that would leave some line item in the general fund revenue to compensate for what you didn't get from the water department.
Right. And I think
you got to remember, I'm sorry, Mike,
No,
I
go
didn't
ahead.
interrupt you, but this is an enterprise fund, and we sell more water to our out-of-town customers than we do our in-town customers, I believe. Am I right in saying that?
That's right.
So what's wrong with us making a little bit of profit?
Absolutely. Which that's,
If we were Tidewater, we would make profit.
well, for another, not for today, but it was brought up the other day when we were talking about those other clients in terms of what the limitations are in terms of what we can raise the rate to. And I think that becomes very important on the water side, because in one case, it's limited to 1.5 of whatever in-town rates are. And I think that's crucial, because to your point, the alternative to fund other activities goes back to the tax base, which is, real estate taxes are a regressive tax. So if we can fund stuff for the town through other resources that are enterprise-based, that would make a hell of a lot more sense.
Well, in Tidewater, but calculates the rates that they're going to charge for their out-of-town customer. They've got a line item for profit that they plug in.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't see anything inconsistent with what I'm talking about.
Absolutely.
So we've kind of built that into the water side, which we'll see hopefully Thursday. But as Bert said, we made a conscious decision not to put that on the wastewater side, although we could.
And one point too is that,
we still want to maintain some level of profit in there.
yeah, well, and there's justification to it too, in that we must be a more efficient provider for out-of-town customers on water, because we can charge less than Tidewater. And we do.
Yeah.
So my idea is if somewhere along the line we build some profit in, and we're not just I realize we're going to have one rate. Well, we're going to, not for out of town, I
Not
guess.
water.
I guess my point is, there's a justification for profit.
Absolutely. No, it makes eminent sense.
Okay, just because we're about out of time for today, circle back to the equivalent meter. Well, let me circle back just to the basis that we've used so far on the ready to serve. We're still okay with that?
I mean, I am, as long as it sounds like you backed the costs out of the
Correct.
flow-based model, so we're not double counting. You have you've legitimately gone in and allocated what you call your administrative costs that are associated with billing and running the system. Administrative.
How do we feel about Matt's use of equivalent meters in order to allocate that administrative cost.
Well, I know you got that, Matt, you got that out of an AWWA manual. What, do they have an explanation for how they came up with their equivalency comparisons or proportionality?
I'm sure there is an explanation. I don't know it off the top of my head, but I will try and dig up something for you for next week.
Yeah,
or next meeting.
if you could just send that page or two that explains that, I think
Yeah.
we'd be in a better position to comment.
I looked at a couple of other sources from that, and it basically is what you would almost expect in terms of the meters are bigger, the meters cost more, yes, excavated cost,
Yeah.
everything was related to cost more versus one, and then they try to linearize it from the standpoint of looking at the pipe sizes and the flow, 13 to 1, 5 to 1, 8 to 1, and I think any one of us who had done an accounting analysis could have come up with, a number similar, maybe larger, maybe smaller, but they came into a zone that was acceptable to their board, I guess.
All right, so we'll get that back up, and then at the next meeting, hopefully we can kind of decide and get that one put to bed as well. We saw the graphics. We had some comments we want to make to the graphics that we would then be able to present. I think we're good on those.
I think overall the graphics are good, Matt. I mean, I think it really helps explain sort of how a comparison of what the rates have been, what they are interim, what they're going to be over the next, grouping of years. So yeah, with maybe some additional labeling, I think the graphics are helpful.
And it will obviously have the table available that
Yeah.
they can look at if they need to.
Yeah.
If you want to look up a particular example, they
The
can.
bar chart was good,
But
your modifications.
yeah, I think.
What's your schedule? I'll let you finish, and that's
Yeah.
kind of where I wanted to get an idea when something has to go somewhere.
Last month.
Yeah.
And just for everyone, I sent out a note to everybody today that we have created a share folder on OneDrive that we're leaving the latest version in. Just be careful when you use it that you don't auto-save or save something on top of it, because that's Matt's. He's keeping his latest version there as well, so that we all have the most up to date. So our next meeting is Thursday. Now you're gonna ask me. 10 o'clock, I believe. 10 Thursday.
I think I communicated earlier. I can't make that.
Right. I think the intent, Matt, would get into the water in a big way. You're gonna have time to make those updates.
Yeah, I think about time. Yep.
Bert and I did go through the same methodology on updating the cost allocations that we did for the wastewater side. We did both at the same time, so we did water as well. So those have already been tweaked on the water side.
That's for the Allendale versus Rehoboth comparison on labor? Okay.
Yeah.
How did you come up with Allendale? Poor Allendale. They
No, I'll tell you why, actually it's legitimate, is under the comprehensive development plan requirements in the state of Delaware, is technically, we are no different than Ellendale. However, they make an exception saying, well, you really aren't the same as Ellendale, and therefore we have to follow the guidelines for a larger municipality. So that's, and in the planning commission, that's been, I guess, for about 5 or 6 years, it's become a standard joke where we're not Ellendale.
Okay, all right. There's
But
history to this.
technically, we are.
Well, as far as our calculations for in rates, I mean, it is the one major task remaining settling on the ready-to-use fee. I mean, we're pretty well
On
set.
wastewater, I think that's it, right?
Yeah.
I think we've settled it, unless something happens between now and then, but
Okay.
we settled on that we are gonna use one. It is gonna have, based on the administrative costs, the due out now is whether we wanna try to use that, an equivalent unit meter, methodology to the.
And that was what I was writing my email today about.
Yeah.
And we had that discussion, but the only thing I was, trying to say is I thought the ratios maybe need to be tweaked, but maybe not, I mean,
Well, let's see how AWWA came up with theirs. I think the one other thing on the wastewater, I guess this applies to water too, is, and maybe Matt can take a first shot at that, or whoever you want to. I certainly don't want to do it, is a short explanation of when we're going from peak, non-peak to this one rate, how peak still factors in, the peak season still factors into that. If we could have a, the elevator speech on that.
I think
written down.
Mike offered on an email 2 weeks ago that he would take his first shot at.
Yeah, and I unfortunately had some health problems
Yeah.
and didn't get to that.
But that's a key.
Yeah, would you be willing to take a stab at it
I'll
again?
still try.
Yeah,
But-
would you?
I think Matt should also weigh in, because he's sort of got his mind wrapped around how he did all this.
Because he knows the numbers.
Yeah, he knows the numbers, and you might have to give an example of a percentage or a number, what the overall percentage that's assigned to the peak period, the peak months versus non-peak. I don't know if that's the right way to do it, but so people can tangibly see that that's factored in as fair a way as we could.
Yeah,
Could
I think
figure
you
out.
gotta, that's great, because if we can't explain that, why we have one rate.
Yeah. It's like a house of cards, it goes down.
Okay.
If I went, could I say one thing
Sure.
about this? If you look at the peak versus non-peak, you just think from a common sense perspective, if you're using 40,000 gallons a year and you're two people living in the house all year round, you're not using 20 in these two quarters and 20 in these two quarters. You're using probably 30% in the winter quarters and you're using 70%, or maybe it's 35%, 65% because of the amount of water you use in the winter time versus the amount of water you use in the summertime. So I think that's part of that explanation. It's not, as we have on, previously 210 in the off-peak and 310 in the peak season. So you're basically, you figure, oh, it's 260. Well, it's not really 260, it's probably closer to $3 on an annual basis. So
Everybody uses more in the summer. It's not just additional people here.
And the summer be the peak.
Right. If we were Ellendale, our summer peak you're exactly
It'd
correct.
still be higher.
All the data shows that if you use 40,000 gallons a year, you use about 25 to 30% more during the summer.
If it's no more than water in your plants.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And so that's why having a peak rate isn't really necessarily just using that highest rate. It's using something closer to the highest rate than it is to the lower rate because of the use at that time.
Everybody's last thing on my bulletin is I sent a note out this morning looking toward next week's schedule. It looks like the best day for us next week is going to be Thursday afternoon at about 2 o'clock. So the police were in here all day. Monday they have a room booked up. So we're going to shoot for it. I'll send something out with that.
Okay.
So with that, anybody from the audience? No Tuesday next week. The room's in use already. So we're just going to do the one meeting next week, Thursday at 2.
And our next meeting is this Thursday.
We have a meeting this Thursday at 10. And
So what's the wrap up on, what's the end date on this? And what's the product that this committee is expected to generate?
Well, we'll probably get the mayor's input on that. I think what we were hoping to be able to do is get something to the board and approved in time for basically the first week of July, because that's when the bills for this quarter were going to go out. And if that were the case, and we could get it all done and the resolution, or the code rewritten and all the things we'd have to do, then the homeowners would never see that interim rate. It would just go right to the rate that we've come up with.
For the next 4 years.
Correct. So to do that, you have to have it really today. You got to start briefing the commissioners, and I don't think we're going to make that.
And then we're gonna ask the two of you to be part of that discussion with the commissioners.
Although I
All
think
right with you?
the whole committee has to be in on that. They're going to send Williams up for that firing squad by himself.
Well, that's again why I think we need.
Why not?
I think we need some product that's in addition to just the workbook or the final rate sheet that gives an explanation, not in a great detail, but in something that's pithy enough that and simple enough, as simple as you can make it, so that people who haven't been involved in this can start to wrap their minds around it, have some comfort level that we've tried to consider everything that we can think of.
If we do nothing else, I'd love to have that to be able to hand on to the people that follow in our footsteps in 4, 8, or 12, or however many years ago.
Yeah.
How in the hell did they come up with
Yeah,
that?
because we didn't get that.
We didn't have that luxury.
And I
Right,
think,
I would have
I think
for
the first
posterity.
sentence or two of that explanation should make the point you just made about what we didn't have, other than somebody decided based on meter size, that we could find no rational basis for how they did it. And I think what happened, it got set, and then it just got ramped up over time, and, because we need them more, and so there was no relationship to, you know, actual expenses and how those expenses should be allocated.
Mr. Williams,
Yes, ma'am.
may I comment on
Sure.
something?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm Tony Sharp, and I'm a ratepayer. And whenever the discussion begins, I'm gonna have 4 questions that I thought it might be helpful if you knew them ahead of time.
Sure, yeah.
And waiting and asking you on that.
Pencil's
Yeah.
ready.
Yeah, right.
Well, the questions are how it works now, briefly. What are the changes and why? Then the justification for the changes. And lastly, the impact on the ratepayer. And when you say pithy and simple explanations, that's the key, I think, for the community to understand the output of all the work you've put into this.
We've really focused on the impacts with the graphs and all. Was that kind of the thing you're looking for, that
I
somebody
don't
could
think the
go?
community's gonna buy graphs.
Okay,
I think the community wants to know, what is the impact on me as a ratepayer?
How much dollars per quarter am I gonna pay if I'm, with what I've been using? Yeah.
Yes.
so how many
Plus-
examples of those do we need?
Well,
Or do you,
I've
or-
shared this with you before.
Or do you have the guy in the laptop in the back that, you know, they come back, okay, mine's,
Your biggest challenge is going to be what you've already, it's just my opinion, which means
Sure.
whatever you think it means. But the biggest challenge is going to be, are certain segments subsidizing others? And if you can win that point with simplicity and straightforward examples, maybe of some different levels, I think that would be very helpful.
I think our goal from the beginning, at least my goal, and I think everybody on the committee, once we sort of got, was to avoid that, whether it happened inadvertently or certainly no intention on anybody, but we also wanted, that's why we asked all these adjustments, so it doesn't happen inadvertently. Try to keep it as pure and fair as our minds can come up with. And unfortunately, we have Matt to run all the numbers. But those, I think those are good questions.
Tony, I have one question, based on you said when we make a presentation. We don't know what the ratepayers are going to pay, because what we've established is the baseline for what ratepayers may be paying. We haven't, to Bert's point, what we were just talking about, on the wastewater side, we were saying maybe maxed out, so it's X. But on the water side, we don't know that. So
Because of the profit.
the
number.
profit, so I'm not.
That's
in
a
other words,
policy decision.
It's a policy decision, but I don't think we want to say, well, here's what the rate would be, but there's still a policy decision that has to be made on what you're really going to pay.
So I think what we're gonna say on the water, here's the base. That's,
Yeah, I have to say, I think terminology becomes very important because we don't want to mislead anybody accidentally.
Yeah.
And they're gonna say, well, wait a minute, you said we were gonna pay $100, and it turns out to be $125. Why the hell is that? So I guess we just have to use caution in what we present,
How
or
you
how we
say it.
present it, how it's said.
or do you want to see it with
I can
a
only,
number in there?
I can only speak for myself, and that is examples of what the expectation is from the ratepayer are gonna go a long way. Because I can tell you, because I can speak for myself as a commissioner, if I don't understand this and I can't explain it,
Sure, can't defend it.
but for my 2 cents, since I won't be here next week, on that point, I think on the water, we should be transparent, as transparent as we can be. So I think you're gonna wind up with probably 2 numbers. You're gonna have a number that's the base that's needed to fund the water expenses. And then somebody, Bert or somebody's gonna have to give Matt guidance on, okay, what's the profit that you need on the water side? And then that gets plugged in to present a different chart.
Even though it's profit, I think it really,
Call it return on investment.
well, return on investment or contribution to other service, that's the base for
Yeah,
developing.
profit in a government is probably not a good term.
A contribution to general fund.
Yeah.
Contribution to
yeah,
general fund.
yeah.
I agree, Mike, that's good, yeah.
But I don't think you can hide that and bury that somewhere in
No,
the
I
rates.
think, actually.
Well, I mean, you can look at our reports for past years and see that the water fund's always had a surplus.
Yeah.
Walter?
I'm sure most people don't read the financials, except for a few of us crazy people. And I think that needs to be stated so people understand historically that has been a source to underwrite the other services of what we do here in the city, both for us as residents and those as tourists and guests. And I think that's important because otherwise people will focus in on just one little piece that's important to them, missing the importance of that piece on a much larger scale.
Well, and I think along that line, Mike, there are plenty of examples in government where enterprise funds contribute to support the general fund. And hopefully the public will accept that because
If they don't, we won't function.
well, otherwise we're going to tax them more.
Well,
Yeah,
there's so much information here, and Matt, to the other end of the phone, the way you make it work and try to explain it, you guys are brilliant. But I think the presentation is going to be twisted back and forth, and now you're talking about the base, which makes absolute sense. But I think you have to stay away from the graphs with too many different colors at the same time, because I think you need to address, first of all, the most of the people that are in the city, in my opinion, are the people that you address first. And then completely separate, you address the different stacks for the people that are in the other areas of 1.5 and the 2, because people need to understand their part, not to get confused which color you're looking at on the chart. Here is what it was, here's what a typical is, what it's estimated to be, and although it does not come down to a finite point, this is what we estimate it to be as close as we can. And this is a recommendation to the city. Is that where it needs a recommendation from this unit to the city? Is that how it comes out?
Yeah, I think our charge is to recommend to the mayor and I guess ultimately the commissioners.
Because there'll be some people that will pick whatever this rate is and think that's the final rate. And I don't like the 50% surcharge, but we all paid it, and so there's not going to be any 50% surcharges or anything. That needs to be announced up front, and it is what it is. And because again, you're going to make a presentation, but don't have all the different categories for simplicity, because I think people are only going to be able to handle their own, and they don't really care what happens to anybody else's rate.
Well, I think along that line, there's a mindset that the rates shouldn't be fair. In other words, there's a mindset in Rehoboth. They're thinking that we should shift more of that burden to another group, whether that and I guess some people say the tourists. Well, hold it. How do you define all that? They're all on property, and so I think if we that's going to be the biggest challenge. So we're no longer, as Roger said, we're not here to protect a group. We're here to have a fair rate for everybody.
I think the other thing, and we did this early on, so it exists, somebody, maybe you guys, looked at other municipalities, whether it's Ocean City or Lewis, something that's similar. We ought to show that because I don't think we're going to be way out of the ballpark from those. So whatever final product we present ought to include, comparisons. I don't know whether that's on a chart or how it's done, but.
Sorry.
I have a suggestion. Rather than come up with a base and then add something for profit, if you will, you start from the other way around and create what you've had in the past. Because as you said, Bert, if you look over the last 10 or 11 years, these two enterprise funds kicked off $7 million. So say it's $650,000 to $800,000 a year on those two funds. That's where the 30% and the 60% are today. It's to create kind of those same levels, and I think that's the way to start with it, rather than come up with, okay, here's your water base rate, but we need $300,000 of profit, so it's this. It's more of where have we been historically? Because I think if you look at the rates that were put in, 30 and 60%, were to kind of come someplace close, the interim rates, someplace close to where we are now. And everybody, I think, kind of accepted those things because they were expecting that because of the wastewater outfall as well. But now we're going to come up with specific, fair, and equitable rates that make sense given the system, because we have found that our ready-to-serve fee today is much too small. And so we weren't preparing for the future. But we have to prepare for the future. That's why the ready-to-serve fee will change, and so it's going to affect the different class of buyers, or users. I think the graphs are good. I think the colors are good. I think, though, to Tony's point, I think each of those, and you said it before, Roger, is having the chart matched up against that graph, so that, you know, you can see on the graph, if you look, you're around $400, but if you can see on the chart, you're at $403, or whatever that is. And I think that'll be helpful. I think you've got plenty of examples that someone's going to fall in between, because if you look at the numbers we've looked at, 85% of the people are someplace between 1 gallon and 50,000 gallons a year. So someone's going to be able to interpolate. You know, I paid $350 last year, now it's $700. Okay, and so on and so forth. But I think as far as the profit stuff, and I understand your points about the wastewater and not creating as much profit there because all of a sudden our debt burden is so huge. But the water thing, I think, is probably something that we should. And I also think it would be very good to show it relative to other communities, because already, just with the 30 and the 60% relative to other communities, we're still very reasonable, if not cheap.
So I think what I'm hearing the mayor say, and I'm okay with that, is we're not going to have a base water and then this is what's the rate because of profit. You're going to put the contribution to other services as part of the water. But I think it's important when this goes forward that that's identified as part of it.
Absolutely. No
So it's not, oh, here's what we think is fair and reasonable, and then somebody says, what's this $300,000 a year or $500,000 buried in here? I think you got to be upfront with it.
As well as Mike said before, it's buried in those numbers that everybody can see, but nobody's looking at it.
Yeah.
And I think, yes, we should have, put a yellow line through it so people realize, but we have an explanation for it because it services our entire community.
And I would like to clarify that if the first question that I put out there, which is how it works now, is answered transparently and honestly, it actually explains what you're talking about with the general fund. Because that's how it works now.
It does.
Nobody understands.
Right.
Yeah.
Possibly, I shouldn't ever say nobody understands. There may be a certain segment who don't have a really good grasp of how it works now. But if we get that out of the way, you're home free with the alignment that you're just carrying it through. My opinion.
One last thing from my perspective, and I think we talked about it a little bit, and people were saying, well, how does it affect me? Well, I think we all know that there are many people in town that want to see how does it affect me. But there are also many people in town that say, well, how does it affect my neighbor that's renting their house? Or the tourist that's down the street using 100,000 gallons? And I think you've shown that, because it's really the flow. And I think we're all trying to make it fair that having access to the system costs X, but using 10 gallons versus 1,000 gallons, it's 100 times different. And that's, I think a lot of people have this feeling that all of a sudden these 40,000 gallon a year users are going to pay so much more of the 200,000 gallon a year users. It's not that case.
No. Oh, these are good.
That's good, yeah.
Good, yeah, I mean, the numbers are the numbers, but you gotta get the concepts, in there too.
Anything else from the audience? Okay, anything else for guys and gals at the table?
So we don't have a per se end date, is what I'm gathering?
As soon
As
as
soon as
possible.
possible.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I hope there's an exit plan on this.
Absolutely, yeah, absolutely.
I've been asking the same thing.
Yeah, so is everybody.
Hey,
My wife's been asking that question too.
yeah, he thinks he's having an affair or something.
No, I told her you
Show
are
her the
with you.
table. Oh,
I
you're
was
with
with you,
Bert, you're
Bert,
saying-
yeah. That worries her even more.
Yeah, really. Rate study on, 14th, Kevin.
We scratched the 14th,
We
because
scratched,
we can't get the room,
okay, and the 16th, is that at 1 PM?
2 o'clock. I'll send an invite out here shortly. Thank you, Ms. Johnson. All right, thanks, Matt.
All right, thank you.
All right.
I'm mental for you.
Yeah.
In order to solve the problem for the pay parking lot becoming a pay parking lot, we put the sign up front last summer.
Oh, yeah.
And then in order to save money, time, you just ripped off the fact that it's a pay parking lot. So the next emergency will come up with the fact that you don't have a sign there. It needs to have the new sign made ahead of time and just be able to change the signs. And it really ought to have not anything to do with uniform traffic signs. But it almost needs to have,
You talking about the one out in the median that points toward the
it almost, out front,
parking lot?
but it almost needs to have an off-centered sign behind it, like you do with 2 pieces of paper on a bulletin board.
Yeah.
So people will know that it changes, but if you go back up there, it just gets so where it's a pay parking lot again, and it needs to be big. Part of the problem is that it's been identified many times that the parking lot, lack of uses, a lot of people don't know it's there.
Correct, yeah.
And I don't know how you do that, it's just so very, very busy, but another good meeting.
Okay, yeah, thank you. Yeah, thanks for
Actually, I have
coming.
one question.
Sure.
You're always comparing your rates to other jurisdictions like Ellendale or whatever.
Yeah.
I know a lot of times you're saying that you're coming in way lower than Tidewater and everything
Yeah.
else. I think when you're trying to justify your increases in rates, actually showing that might help soften the blow a little bit, because you sit there and say, wow, we have a 50% gain, but compared to other
It's still half
towns,
of what they're
we're still well below them.
That's not too bad.
Nothing. So, just a suggestion.